Hey everybody, it's Christy, and I am here filming the first episode of the One Sentence podcast. So what I thought I would do is I thought I would set up my camera. I'm recording here on my computer. I got my mic, I got my script, and I've had about, 14 takes here so far. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to record this on my phone so that I can share it with you guys on YouTube and also have the video of what goes on when you're recording a podcast. So I hope that you find this episode informative. I hope that you find this episode meaningful. And I hope that you'll continue to tune in every 2 weeks for new episodes. So here we go. Episode 1. Hello, I am so thrilled. Welcome to the first episode of the One Sentence podcast. You guys, I am just so excited that you're here. I am excited for everybody who has cheerleaded me and supported me and encouraged me this far. And I can't believe I'm here. This has been years in the making. I had a vision many years ago for a platform to discuss sensitive topics, experiences. So my vision for this space is to open a dialogue, a conversation about incarceration in America. We're going to talk about statistics, of course, but I really want to talk to you about the stories, because you guys, the stories, man, I can't tell you the stories that I've heard, the story that I've lived, but we're going to try to talk about it here, because the multitude of stories, they span the width, the breadth of humanity. And these stories, they usually start with one sentence. My story starts like any other American story. I grew up in South Florida, a little girl in a middle-class family. I had a myriad of hopes and dreams for myself. I knew that things were hard. I was a child of divorce before I even learned how to walk. So I knew I was well acquainted with dysfunction. But I always did well. I played sports. I got really good grades. I poured myself into extracurricular activities. I think I felt the need to perform for my parents' love, for their attention. And that drive continued well into my adulthood. Sorry, I had to take a moment and pause because there was a plane. All right, here we go. I earned a full scholarship to the University of Florida. I became a Gator. I loved college. I did well. I succeeded. I graduated in 2001. I was already a mother at that point. And at that point, I wanted to continue my idea of perfection. The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect homemaker, perfect employee. The list goes on. At the time, my husband was a full-time student and a National Guard member. So as a National Guard member, he would go once a month for drill and 2 weeks in the summer. But as our country transitioned from 9/11, the dynamics of our military changed. And my husband went from full-time student to full-time soldier as he was deployed to Iraq. And the dynamics instantly changed in our family. I continued to work. Take care of my daughter, take care of our home. As the family changed and transmuted, my husband began to sink deeper and deeper within himself each month of deployment. And that deployment lasted 17 months. Upon his arrival back on American soil, it did not take long for me to realize that he had left the best part of himself in the sands of war. The bottle became a deeper comforter for him, and depression became my partner. We slipped further and further away from each other until our marriage was just like a smoldering rubble of harsh words, painful actions, cycles of emotional turmoil. And I struggled to really maintain my grip on life. But there was no one, not a single person in my life who would ever perceive the desperation that I felt within myself. You see, now there's a lot of talk about mental health and self-care. But then there wasn't. I didn't understand. I didn't have the time to figure it out. I mean, my house was comfortable, pretty, decorated. My children were cared for. They were doing well, developing, growing, changing. My husband was the all-American guy. But man, behind the walls, the silence was deafening. And the sadness, man, it just encompassed my entire being. I really struggled with how to get help, what to do, and even at that point, what was even wrong? So, in order to continue this facade of perfection, even though financially we were struggling, at this point I was staying home. We had 2 children. I became pregnant with my 3rd in the midst of a lot of this. I began to take things that weren't mine. Decorate my home, clothe my children, eventually to feed my family. There was a lot of verbal and emotional abuse, climbing and climbing and climbing. But I'm going to tell you something that is not talked about a lot in these stories, and that is the financial control. That financial control, because I stayed home, began to close its fingers on my throat. I felt suffocated, trapped. Things were not improving, and my mental health was beginning to drown me. I didn't know what to do. And you're going to hear that story a lot in the beginning of my story. You're going to hear a lot about, I didn't know. I felt lost. I didn't know what to do. And I just want to let you know that that's a common theme. In the stories that I heard while incarcerated of people that I met during this journey, a lot of them start with similar scenarios. Broken families, abusive, a lot of drug addiction, a lot of these threads will be woven through many of the stories. But you guys, I just want to tell you that I entered the gates of prison and it saved my life. I may have never physically died from what I was doing, but emotionally, I was dying slow, painful death, day by day, hour by hour. I remember walking into the county jail, and they have a mirror. It's not really a mirror, you guys. It's like a piece of reflective plastic. And I remember looking at myself and thinking, who am I? And what do I want out of this life? Because at this point, I had no idea. I was 32 years old with no idea of who I was or what I wanted out of my life. So while it was an experience I wish I could have saved myself from, I would never trade the growth, this person that rose out of the ashes of that dying life, I would not trade it for anything. I began to really take a deep look at who I was and what I wanted. And the stirrings began of what it meant to care for myself. I knew really well how to care for other people. I was good at that. But I really didn't know how to care for myself. So I began that journey within the walls of prison. I began to exercise. I began to write. I kept a journal that I wrote in every day. I took writing classes. I became a part of a few re-entry programs. And it was at that point that I reconnected with my soul's song. I understood that my life had more meaning and purpose than what I had previously known. And you know, when I walked through the gates, I walked against the grain of most who walk through the gates. You know, I thought that everything would just fall into place. I would just do my time and move on. And that's just not the story for me. Incarceration changed me. It changed me in good ways. It also changed me in bad ways. And during the course of this podcast, we're going to talk about those things. We're going to talk about the good ways and the bad ways that incarceration affects people. I came in with a different perspective. I had education. I had a supportive extended family. I had things that some did not have, and I was fortunate in that respect. At this point, I had 3 kids at home. My husband had filed for divorce when I was in county jail before I was ever sentenced to state prison and mandated to their custody. But I just thought that everything would be okay. I remember fervently praying and begging that God would save my marriage. And I know that there are so many of you that have done the same. Maybe not while incarcerated, but you've done the same. And, you know, things did fall into place, but not in the way that I had imagined or envisioned or written a scripted plan, because that's what perfectionists do. While I was incarcerated, I did not speak to my younger two children for the last 3 years of my incarceration. I would call home and there would be no answer. Sometimes there was no money put on the phone. I would write letters. They were returned to sender. My daughter had the most effects from this incarceration. You see, because this is another piece of the story that's not talked about. While we incarcerate an individual, and when that happens, we're not just incarcerating that one person. We're incarcerating an entire family. Whether they have children or not, parents, extended family. And we need to start analyzing and thinking about those things because it is critical to understand and navigate those pieces while we discuss social change and the need for it. Once I was released from prison, I still didn't speak to my children. It took more than a year to talk to them, to even get them on the phone in a healthy way. And we'll talk about that in some episodes too. And even longer to hold them and touch them and be with them. And while I was away, while I was incarcerated, they suffered intense abuse at the hands of a narcissistic woman who convinced them that their mother was evil, that their mother was non-existent, and that their mother was not their mother. All the while murdering their little souls. But during the 5+ years that we were kept apart, I never abandoned the fight. And I think this is something that is so important to understand. When a woman is incarcerated, so when I was incarcerated, I'm going to talk about it in my perspective and not the perspective of generalities. When I was incarcerated, I quickly learned that the control that I thought that I had, I did not have. Not only by the circumstances within the walls, but also with the circumstances outside of the walls. I would call and hear silence. I would get letters back, returned to sender. But I continued to hope and dream of a future with my children, and so many mothers do. Whether they're serving a year or 30 years, they never abandon their desire and hope for their children. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule. And we're going to talk a lot about that. We're going to talk a lot about the design of the justice system, what it's intended for. But man, there is so much work to be done. If you are not following the One Sentence podcast, I would encourage you to go over to Instagram and follow at One Sentence Podcast. There are some posts up in the comments. I've already heard from several of you about your story, your family's story. And man, the stories, it always goes back to the stories. Because I have a story to tell. My story is one of hope, of salvation. It's a story about women, about mothers. But it's also a story about a system and one thing that we need to understand is that this system needs work. That was kind of my vision for this podcast, is to talk about the prison system in America, the justice system in America. Because one thing that is very critical to understanding and desiring change is to know that the justice system is oftentimes not about justice. But this is my story. And I'm sure there are many who will listen who have their own story. I know that we all come in with opinions. But I want you to know that I am just so thankful that you're here. When you opened up your podcast and clicked on play, it helped me to know that you want to see change too. Or that you're open to understanding that the ways of thinking are antiquated. I really hope that as you listen every 2 weeks to this podcast, whether it be my story, whether it be the story of children who have incarcerated parents, whether it be nonprofit organizations and reentry programs that come to talk about the systems that they're designing programs to make change in, I want you to know it's important work. Because as I stated on my Instagram, 95% of state prisoners will be released. So these stories matter. These stories are not just about other people. These stories are about us, about our communities, about our networks. Because of the stories that I heard, a lot of them started with one choice. And I know that we've all made some choices that we wish we wouldn't have made. And so I hope that as you listen in the coming weeks and the coming months, that you would be open to understanding, that you would be open to advocating. I just want to share my story. We'll talk about all sorts of things here. We'll talk about life inside the walls. We'll talk about life inside. But we'll also talk about the befores and the afters. And I hope that this story, my story, changes something. Whether it's a heart, a system, a policy. I know that it all starts with one choice. And that one choice sometimes leads to one sentence.